Today we're going to be talking about pollution and pollution in the environment, a lot of different ways that we can wind up with pollution in an environment. We're going to talk about the three major forms of pollution that we see, the impact that form has on an ecosystem, and then the sources of where that pollution can come from. So when we think about pollution, or we hear that word pollution, probably that brings to mind trash, or we're talking about things being introduced into an ecosystem, into a water supply, toxins in the air, things that are being introduced that would naturally not be there, right? Because a natural ecosystem doesn't really have its own pollution, right? We don't go into the woods and be like, wow, all of these squirrels and bears have really trashed this place. They just kind of live within their ecosystem. So a lot of the pollution, unfortunately, is man-made. Most of the things that we're going to be talking about today have their roots in man-made systems and man-made problems, because it's just what we do a lot of times interferes with natural ecosystems. So that's why we have to be careful, and we have to be aware of what we're doing and where those products of our manufacturing and industrial processes are going, because ultimately we don't want them winding up in the ecosystem, because we know that we rely on the ecosystem for a lot of different things. So if all of this pollution damages the ecosystem to the point where we can't get the things out of it that we need, then we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot by putting the waste and things in there in the first place. So there's all different types of pollution, and they all have the ability to impact the ecosystem and then the organisms that live within an ecosystem, right? Because the organisms are reliant on the resources in that ecosystem. If the resources are becoming polluted, then that trickles down to the organisms. The first type of pollution that I want to talk about is water pollution. Water pollution can happen in a lot of different ways. What ultimately happens, in addition, we think about maybe like an oil getting into the water. And that's usually kind of like a direct form of pollution, especially if we have like a leaking, like an oil tanker that's leaking in the ocean. We can clean that up, and it's bad, but it's not as bad as like just the repeated release of chemicals into the water supply, because what happens when we release chemicals into the water supply, we get a chemical imbalance in the water. And when we get a chemical imbalance in the water, then that affects everything that lives in the water. It affects, the invertebrates that are living in the water. It affects the single-celled organisms that are living in the water. It affects the plants that are growing in the water, and that affects the animals that feed on those. So all layers and levels of the food chain are affected when you get a chemical imbalance in water. The aquatic organisms are going to be directly affected, obviously, because they're living in that water, but the entire ecosystem is affected indirectly, because they either rely on organisms that live in that water, or they rely on that water to drink, right? Because all living things need water to survive. Whether they're living in it or whether they're drinking it, you've got to have water. So when you have polluted water, that creates a really big problem for every organism within the ecosystem. So where does this water pollution come from? Several different sources and several different ways that our water can become polluted. Industrial waste, manufacturing, industrial type processes, producing chemicals. If those chemicals aren't carefully regulated as to where they're going, if they aren't disposed of properly, they're eventually going to wind up in our water supply. If they're, flushed down a drain or just released into a river or whatever the case may be, obviously that's going to have a huge impact. If they're not going through any kind of, process where they're at least being reduced to an acceptable level or something like that, but if they're just being straight dumped into our ecosystem, that causes a lot of problems and pollutes the water heavily. A lot of the agriculture that we do, so, the farming for growing food. And when we grow food in large quantities, we use a lot of chemicals. We use pesticides, we use herbicides, we use a lot of different things to ensure that our crop doesn't get destroyed by disease, or it doesn't get destroyed by insects or anything like that. So we put a lot of chemicals onto a field. Well, those chemicals don't just go into the plant and then never go anywhere else. We put an extra amount on there so the plant absorbs what it needs or what it can, and the rest is in the soil. And then when you get a heavy rain, that runoff finds its way, to the lowest point, which is going to be, a pond or a stream or a river. And most rivers and streams make their way back to larger rivers, and then most of those rivers, the big rivers, carry that water to a larger body of water like a lake or an ocean. So it kind of all just collects there, right, in those large bodies of water. And so, like I said, we have a lot of different things agriculturally that can wind up in our water supplies. Another place where we see, we don't think about this one as much, but the detergents that we use, right? So the detergents that we use to wash our clothes, those types of things, they can wind up in our water supply if they don't get correctly, processed in a water treatment plant, or if they just get dumped out. Those detergents, a lot of them are phosphate based. And phosphate is, normally in an aquatic ecosystem, a phosphate is really, it's kind of a limiting nutrient. It's a limiting factor. There's not a lot of it there. So when you introduce detergents which are phosphate based, they now all of a sudden this water supply has a whole bunch of phosphorus that it didn't have before. And so you have this process called eutrophication, which is basically where you have an imbalance in the water and it results in a lot less oxygen in the water than normal. And so when you have organisms that rely on the oxygen that's dissolved in water and suddenly there's less of it because of the presence of these phosphates, now you have a situation where you have organisms that are literally dying in water because they can't breathe. Right? So, like I said, that's one of those things we don't think about, but detergents and soaps and those types of things, they find their way into our water supplies pretty easily. Another area where we have to worry about pollution is in the air. Air pollution, we see it all the time in, smog, and we see some large, stacks that are just bellowing, black smoke or gray smoke into the environment. So with that, you can have air that becomes toxic to organisms. You can have air that becomes poisonous, depending on what's in the air and how close to the source those organisms are. And if you have really heavily industrialized areas, you don't usually see a lot of you don't have a heavily industrialized area and then a forest right next to that, right? Because that forest is going to suffer. The trees do a great job of, taking out some of the things, like carbon dioxide and that sort of thing, but chemicals and things like that, they're not really built to do that. That's not what they're set up for, and it usually chokes them out. And then if you have the loss of vegetation, then you have the loss of the entire ecosystem. So, these chemicals in the air, they can affect the producer's ability to photosynthesize because there's simply too many chemicals in there for them to sort out. Chemicals like sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide, that can lead to acid rain. So those two chemicals, they go up into the atmosphere and there they combine with water and oxygen, and that goes through a process that creates acid rain, which then when you have precipitation, you have rain that's very acidic. Normal rain, is going to be, somewhere in a pH range of, 5.5 to 6, somewhere in there. It's slightly acidic. You're not going to have pure pH 7 rain all the time. But with acidic rain, you're getting into the really low numbers. You're getting into a pH of 3.5 or 4, 4.5, somewhere around in there, where you have the ability to, this acid rain can, deteriorate statues, which are made of marble and have really, negative impacts on ecosystems. It can destroy trees, destroy vegetation. It's really, really harmful. And that comes from, unfortunately, from air pollution. So where do we get this air? Where do we get all these pollutants? Similar sources to water. We've got industry, which is, putting particles into the air. Burning coal, right, is going to put excess carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. When we burn substances, even if it's wood, but if we burn things that really aren't intended to be burned, like rubber, plastics, those types of things, we go through a lot of a pretty entailed process to create those rubbers and create those plastics, and they weren't really ever intended to be burned. If you've ever seen a tire burn, a tire just burns straight black smoke, and you don't even really have to know anything about environments or chemicals to know, like, wow, that doesn't look very good, because it's just a giant black cloud that kind of smolders for a very long time. And then we also, of course, have the combustion from engines, which just puts, carbon back into the environment. So especially, it can be dangerous. The combustion can be dangerous in an enclosed space because then you have the formation of carbon monoxide, right? Now, if you don't have an enclosed space, it's fine because it's going to combine with oxygen in the atmosphere and it's going to be fine. In an enclosed space, you have carbon monoxide, which forms. That's what's coming out of a tailpipe. And if it's not combining with oxygen, then that becomes a deadly gas. So that's definitely something to watch out for. The third and final type of pollution that I wanted to discuss is soil pollution. And that is going to be, pollutants of all kinds that wind up to get wind up getting in the soil, which is going to affect plants' ability to grow, because they need certain nutrients, but they don't need chemicals and toxins and those types of things. The soil can wind up being no longer fertile, and this has a lasting impact on an ecosystem. If we put pollutants into the air, and then that process, we quickly shut that down, and the air can cycles through, and we get it kind of clears up. Water, we can do the same kind of thing. With the soil, if we get something in the soil, then you have to think about that's getting right back into the vegetation, and it can stay there for a long time. And that can also impact our ground water supply, right? Because we've got aquifers and things like that and reservoirs in the ground. So if our soil is being polluted, then that means our groundwater supply is being polluted. So very similar sources with this, industry, agriculture. And then we also have to think about how we dispose of our waste. Most of our waste winds up in a landfill. We just take all of our trash and it gets collected, and then it gets shipped off somewhere, and then it's just kind of buried underground. And a lot of that stuff will decompose, but a lot of it doesn't, right? And so we don't really know the long-term effects of that. We've just kind of been, putting a lot of our trash and a lot of our waste in landfills, and just kind of hoping that it's in an area where it's not going to, contaminate our water supply and cause too many problems. No matter what the type of pollution, they all cause problems for an ecosystem and can greatly impact not just the ecosystem, but the organisms that live there.